In 1960, South Korea's per capita income was $89, less than Ghana, less than Sudan. The country had just survived a catastrophic civil war, a collapsed government, and a society that, by every measurable indicator, had no future. Then, on the morning of May 16, 1961, tanks rolled across the Han River Bridge, and everything changed. Not through revolution, not through democracy, not through foreign aid, through one man's radical decision to treat an entire nation like a military operation and refuse to stop until it worked. This is the story of Park Chung-hee, the soldier who engineered a miracle, the dictator who built a democracy he never wanted, and the machine he constructed that is still running today. To understand what Park Chung-hee built, you first need to understand what built Park Chung-hee. He was born in 1917 in a village near Daegu, into poverty so absolute that academic excellence was his only exit. He won a place at a Japanese military academy, not through privilege, but through sheer competitive force. He trained in Manchuria. He studied Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet state in northeastern China, where imperial technocrats were running one of the most aggressive developmental state experiments in modern history. Government-directed industrial policy, state-controlled credit allocation, forced mobilization of human and material resources in service of a national mission. Park internalized every lesson. As the economic historian Myung-Soo Cha documents in his analysis of Korean development, the colonial period had already laid critical institutional foundations: modern property rights, an education system, infrastructure networks. But by 1953, the Korean War had obliterated roughly a quarter of the capital stock. What remained was a country running on American aid and political corruption, governed by Syngman Rhee, whose administration had turned import substitution into a mechanism for bribery rather than production. The system wasn't just inefficient, it was structurally incapable of escape. Park's coup on May 16, 1961, was not, in any conventional sense, a political event. It was a management takeover, a hostile acquisition of a failing enterprise by a strategist who believed he knew exactly what the problem was and exactly how to fix it. He moved immediately. He arrested corrupt business executives. He nationalized the banks, placing the entire credit apparatus of the nation under state control. He created the Economic Planning Board, modeled explicitly on Japan's legendary MITI. He launched the first five-year plan in 1962. And then, he made his most consequential decision. He abandoned import substitution, the orthodox development strategy of the era, and pivoted to export-oriented industrialization. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Instead of protecting domestic firms from global competition and hoping they'd improve, throw them into the ocean and tell them to swim. Allocate state credit not based on political connections, but based on export performance. If you hit your targets, you get more capital. If you don't, the state withdraws support and lets you drown. This is what economists call command capitalism, and as Myung-Soo Cha's research confirms, it worked with extraordinary precision. In the decade following the strategic shift, per capita output doubled. Agriculture's share of GDP fell from 45% to 25%. Manufacturing's share rose from 9% to 27%. But Park didn't stop there. He needed corporate engines large enough to execute industrial transformation at national scale. So he created them, or more precisely, he selected them. Existing family-owned firms, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, were given preferential access to state-directed credit, protected markets, and export licenses. In exchange, they were expected to perform, hit the plan's targets, expand into designated sectors, accept state discipline. This is the architecture of chaebol hegemony, and it was not organic. It was engineered, from above, by a government wielding credit as a weapon. Park famously absorbed intelligence briefings from university economists, 3 hours per day, one-on-one. He convened monthly export promotion conferences where he personally reviewed performance data. He was, in the words of one analyst, not a charismatic field commander, but a planner-strategist, obsessed with evaluation, with feedback loops, with the mechanics of execution. He treated GDP like a military campaign, and he was winning. By the mid-1960s, Park had identified an opening. America was escalating in Vietnam and needed reliable allies willing to commit ground forces. Park had 600,000 men under arms and an economy hungry for foreign capital. The transaction was straightforward. Between 1965 and 1973, South Korea deployed over 300,000 troops to Vietnam, the largest non-American military contribution to the war. In exchange, Washington provided construction contracts for Korean firms, preferential access to U.S. military procurement, technology transfers, and the capital flows that would finance the next phase of Korean industrialization. This is geopolitical clientelism, operating at its most sophisticated, the deliberate monetization of a strategic relationship to fund national development. Park had looked at the Cold War frontier and seen not just a security threat, but a resource. The Gyeongbu Expressway, 428 kilometers of highway through mountainous terrain, completed faster than almost any comparable infrastructure project in history, was financed in part through Vietnam War earnings. POSCO, which would become one of the most efficient steel producers on Earth, was built with Japanese normalization money, diplomatic capital Park extracted from the 1965 treaty with Tokyo, a decision that provoked mass protests across South Korea, but injected hundreds of millions of dollars into the industrial base. Park's relationship with the United States operated within what scholars call hegemonic stability, the Cold War framework in which American strategic interests created space for authoritarian developmental regimes to operate with significant autonomy, so long as they remained firmly anti-communist and strategically reliable. Park understood this architecture perfectly. He exploited it with precision. Inside Korea, the security development nexus had a rural dimension as well. The Saemaul Undong, the New Village movement, launched in 1970, was simultaneously a genuine rural modernization program and a political mobilization tool. Roads were paved, electricity was extended, agricultural productivity improved. But the movement was also a mechanism for incorporating the rural population into the state's developmental project, transforming farmers into stakeholders in the national mission, generating consent through visible material improvement. As researcher Hwang Byung-ju documents, poor farmers responded with genuine enthusiasm to the modernization discourse. The regime's message, "Let us live well, let us escape poverty," resonated deeply with populations that had known nothing but scarcity. The state's dominant discourse of nationalism and economic mobilization was, for many Koreans, not experienced as coercion. It was experienced as possibility. That popular investment in the developmental project is critical to understanding what came next. Because when Park felt that possibility beginning to threaten his control, he crushed it. By 1971, Park had been president for nearly a decade. The economy was growing at rates that stunned the world, and he was losing support. In the presidential election of that year, opposition candidate Kim Dae-jung received 45.3% of the vote, including nearly 60% in Seoul. In a free society, that would have been an exit. Park was not building a free society. On October 17, 1972, Park declared martial law, dissolved the National Assembly, and suspended the constitution he had himself written. What followed was the Yushin Constitution, a document that concentrated virtually unlimited power in the presidency, established the National Congress for Reunification to elect the president indirectly, and authorized emergency decrees that could not be challenged in any court. The word Yushin means renewal or revitalization. What it created was, in the analysis of scholar Yoon Hae-dong, a sovereign dictatorship, a system that claimed its legitimacy not from democratic mandate, but from the general will of the nation, channeled through constitutional bodies that Park himself controlled. It was anti-liberal democracy taken to its logical conclusion. The nation's will was Park's will. The mechanics of control were not subtle. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency, the KCIA, functioned as the operational core of what scholars have called the internal security architecture. Its director was effectively the second most powerful figure in the country. Its operatives were embedded in factories, universities, neighborhoods, and opposition political offices. As one witness later documented, the factor of fear was central and pervasive. The mere probability of KCIA surveillance was sufficient to suppress most organized dissent. Political dissidents were imprisoned. Some were tortured. Some were executed. Labor organizers, particularly the thousands of women and girls staffing the critical light manufacturing industries, faced conditions that went far beyond what any sanitized account of authoritarian governance can adequately capture. But here is the analytical paradox that makes this case so difficult and so important. As scholar Lee Sang-rok documents, throughout the Yushin era, a loose but genuine structure of consent existed alongside the apparatus of coercion. The widely circulated slogans, "Let us live well," "Let us overcome poverty," resonated because they reflected real material improvement. Unemployment was falling. Household consumption was rising. The workers of Hyundai shipbuilding, even while subjected to brutal labor discipline, were watching their living standards improve year by year. The regime was a mass dictatorship, to use the analytical framework of scholar Jae-hyun Lim, not purely a system of external force, but one that had successfully penetrated the everyday consciousness of ordinary Koreans and generated genuine, if complex, forms of popular investment. Park had built a machine that required both engines to run simultaneously: prosperity and repression, development and surveillance. Each legitimized the other. And as the 1970s progressed, the machine became increasingly unstable. The second oil shock hammered the economy. The HCI, heavy and chemical industry, drive, launched partly to reduce dependence on American military guarantees, generated inflation, non-performing loans, and a structural distortion that would take a decade to unwind. The protests in Busan and Masan in October 1979 were not merely political demonstrations. They were the eruption of accumulated economic frustration among the urban lower classes whom development had simultaneously created and marginalized. Park had stopped learning. His planning discipline, the great strength of his early years, had calcified into rigidity. He had no exit strategy. On the night of October 26, 1979, at a private dinner inside the KCIA compound in Seoul, Park Chung-hee was shot by his own intelligence director, Kim Jae-kyu. The immediate trigger, as documents later revealed, was a disagreement over how to handle the Busan-Masan protests. Park had demanded a response that would have meant the deaths of tens of thousands. Kim pulled a gun instead. It was a death entirely consistent with the system Park had built, a system where the instruments of coercion were so powerful and so close to the center of power that they eventually turned inward. In the 50 years since, the debate over Park's legacy has never been resolved, and perhaps cannot be. As intellectual Park Chung, himself a target of the regime's repression, acknowledged with remarkable honesty. Park's choice of export-led growth, his particular combination of industrial strategy and political discipline, reflected a more realistic assessment of South Korea's actual position in the world than his critics offered at the time. The democratic opposition, for all its courage, had no concrete economic alternative. And yet, the export-led model generated a middle class. The middle class generated demands that the Yushin Constitution could not contain. The democracy that emerged from the mass uprisings of 1987 was, in a deeply uncomfortable sense, a product of the very industrialization that the dictatorship had forced into existence. As one historian observed, Park's development was meritorious and unsustainable, in a double sense. Unsustainable ecologically, unsustainable politically. It could not continue. But it could, and did, transform the foundation upon which something better could eventually be built. By 1979, per capita income had risen from $89 to $1,589. Exports had grown 360-fold. A country that had been one of the poorest on earth had become an industrialized nation. The machine Park built outlived him. The democracy that machine produced eventually put his daughter in the presidency, and then removed her in disgrace. History, in Korea, has a very dark sense of irony. The question is not whether Park Chung-hee was a good man. He almost certainly was not. The question that history forces us to sit with is far more uncomfortable. Could the miracle have happened any other way? We don't know. We only know what did happen. And what did happen reshaped the geopolitical map of East Asia permanently.